Hi guys, I'm Lynn-Marie. I just want to start by thanking all the gang of bloomers because I'll forget at the end. Um, this is such a weird way of giving a talk, uh, so you'll have to excuse me if I'm constantly looking down at my notes. Um, so my practice is very much research based, and so I decided that that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about some of my research to give you a kind of an idea of the journey that my research went on to get to the point that it is at today. So I'm going to talk to you about museums. I'm going to talk to you about the Grand Tour. I'm going to talk to you about the French Revolution. I'm going to talk about the Enlightenment. But first, I'm going to talk about Star Trek. Uh, whenever Captain Kirk lands on a planet with a lost civilization, we're generally met with this kind of picture of ancient Greece. You get broken statues, ruined temples, and these big imposing white marble columns that dominate the alien landscape. There's normally blue sand because it's an alien planet. But the set kind of tells a story of a people at the pinnacle of civilization, a people of music, of poetry, of philosophy. It's generally a landscape full of the symbolism of ancient Earth. We get it immediately. That's the thing. We know these people. We are these people, you know. Normally the episode ends with some ridiculous alien masquerading as Apollo and threatening the Enterprise, but that's not really important. So the point is that we see these bare white columns, the pristine marble statues, and we're automatically drawn into a narrative of a great civilization. So my research tries to kind of draw attention to how easily history can be manipulated and how casually we can be drawn into a fiction. And I do this by playing with the idea of museums. So museums they're like microcosms, like tiny worlds within worlds intended to reflect the entirety of our history back to us, or the entirety of our culture back at us. They're repositories, the repositories of the collective knowledge of all of humanity. But importantly, they're institutions whose authority seems unquestionable. But they're not neutral spaces where we can encounter an untarnished representation of the past. They're contested spaces, and they have a power to frame how we view history. They exist with this gets kind of a little bit researchy here. So the idea is that they kind of exist within society in a kind of an isolation or a quarantine that's separate from what's going on outside. And they're this single site that contain infinite histories, stories, times, mythologies, spaces. And they function differently at different points in history. And that's normally dictated by whatever culture they're attached to. A good example of this is the Louvre in Paris. So that was originally the kind of the brainchild or the idea of Louis XVI. And the whole idea behind it was to create this museum of treasures that would demonstrate to the world the supremacy of French art and, by proxy, the supremacy of France and its monarch. But what happened was the French Revolution, and the revolutionaries took this idea of the museum and appropriated it, and the new regime used it to kind of legitimize the revolution, kind of as a way of influencing and reinforcing the new national identity of France. So it acted as this instrument of education. So it gave the citizens access to the ousted monarch's treasures. So it showed the strength of the new regime and created, and they used the art then to create new mythologies that would reinforce the new nation's place in a kind of a grander history. So I suppose what it means is like museums set a narrative. So throughout my research, this idea of this kind of idea of being able to control a narrative has become an increasing obsession, I suppose, like an obsession with ideas of truths. So how truths are formed, who establishes what is true, and how truth can be concealed or revealed. When considering classical architecture and art, you can see it from different points of time, different time periods in history, and each point will tell you something new about whatever objects or displays they have going on. So a lot of my research was about museums and how they came into existence, and that led me on to doing a lot of research about the Grand Tour. Now the Grand Tour was sorry if I'm going too fast, it's really strange doing it this way. The Grand Tour was a custom of the late 16th century and onwards to about the early 19th century, where English gentlemen of privilege, they would finish their education by going on this grand tour, this educational trip that would take about 2 to 3 years. And they would visit the cultural and historic places of Europe. So they were expected to gain an understanding of art and architecture by exposure to the great masterpieces and historic cultural places. So they would visit Paris, Venice, Florence, all those kinds of big European cities, but the most important destination was Rome, because Rome was where the treasures were. And since there was no museums at the time, especially in Europe, these gentlemen would use their privilege to gain access to private collections and excavation sites of the ancient world. And their time was well spent. They spent a lot of their time acquiring souvenirs in the form of art, sculpture, and maybe some Elgin marbles. So many of these collections of souvenirs went on to form the basis of modern day museums. The other thing is that the Grand Tour took place in the time of the Enlightenment, where things like logic and rationality were kind of the guiding parameters of thought. The logical, symmetrical structure of ancient monuments and temples were kind of almost a physical embodiment of this approach to thinking. So these young men sent out on the Grand Tour, returned and began to emulate the Greeks, attempting to recreate the kind of the nobility and the grandeur of a great civilization. And they did this by building like follies in the garden of ancient temples, and this kind of eventually transferred into culture and became neoclassical architecture. And these neoclassical buildings became a way of promoting a sense of power and authority that they thought reflected the power and authority of Greece. And it helped to create a cultural hegemony where the ruling classes could manipulate the culture of a society so that their worldview became the accepted worldview. So I am going to end the history lesson at some point, but first I'm going to give you an example of one grand tourist and how he influenced my work. So his name was Henry Blundell. He went on the Grand Tour a little bit later in life, so he was a little bit older than most of the guys who would have gone over. So it was in around the 18th century. And he amassed a vast collection of Roman and Greek antiquities. And like many of his contemporaries, when he returned, he started to emulate them. He built a temple in his back garden, which I'm sure was huge. But what he also did was he restored a lot of his acquisitions. He brought home bits of sculptures and like grafted Roman arms onto Greek sculptures and kind of imposed a kind of an 18th century and 19th century aesthetic and morality onto these ancient sculptures and architecture. He would do things like sand off all the original color from the statues, because what was attractive at the time was the pure, austere white marble or sorry, this is very strange. So these are no longer Greek statues. They were no longer Roman copies of Greek statues. They were 18th century artifacts. They were part of the 18th century now. I'm going to give you a little quote from a letter that Henry Blundell wrote to one of his friends, which I think is kind of real illustration of this. My Diana is also a fine specimen of ancient sculpture all over. The parts are almost all its own except the face, which was found so much disfigured as to require a new mask. So he just built a new face for this sculpture, like completely from his own imagination, or the sculptor's imagination. And it's this kind of bastardizing of history and all its implications that can be filtered into one object that fascinated me. This idea that you could take something from 2,000 years ago and just turn it into some sort of Frankenstein's monster of history. And it's this that really influenced my work. So I'm going to talk about the work from Problems of Frailty, because I think this was the first kind of eureka moment in my research, and how the research and the practice connected. It's kind of like a lodestone for my practice. Whenever I get a little bit kind of, what the hell am I doing? I go back to that. So process is really important in my practice. I work mainly in printmaking and sculpture. I have a few elements of performance and video in there as well, but it's mainly sculpture and printmaking. And I like to try and link the two. I like to kind of play with the boundaries there, because I think they're very similar processes in terms of creating a matrix and taking patterns and taking replicas and things like that. And it's very important for me for the process of the work to be very visible to the viewer. And I like to leave clues about the process in the work, and I like to reference different processes in different pieces. So if I'm making a piece of sculpture, I might reference some of my prints that are in the same kind of assemblage or the same kind of space. So I started using images of Greek and Roman architecture and sculpture as this kind of way of representing the institution, like the museum or whatever institution. But the trick was to kind of build in as many contradictions as I could into each object, and to at the same time kind of cram each object with information, so that it's almost like that kind of bastardized sculpture where there's so much history and so much stuff in it, but it's still the same image. So I used the example of Star Trek at the start. One, because I'm a Trekkie and I like to talk about Star Trek, and the other is because a lot of my work mimics the idea of a set or a stage. It's only a facade. I use the imagery to create these cardboard cutouts with like crudely printed images that are they're just A4 paper printed out and stuck on and supported by kind of these wooden frames that are very exposed. And I'm just going to kind of go through some of the little things that I add to them, or that I think I add to them. That's this idea of adding in contradictions and information. So they can be assembled, disassembled, and reassembled again in another space. So their context is quite fluid. And it changes wherever I set them up. Like they're in my bedroom now, and So the original images that I use are screen grabs from Google Images. They're just these tiny little images that get blown up to the approximate size of the original sculptures. So they become pixelated, they become blurred, they become kind of distorted through the process of kind of digital manipulation. And then they're sliced up into A4 sheets, and they're put back together again with sellotape. So that's again, I'm manipulating them again. And then of course there's the 2D nature of them. The 2D I really love, because as you walk around these sculptures in space, their perspective warps and you kind of get a different view of them, and you walk around and it's just these exposed frames and sellotaped onto the, well, not sellotaped, but duct taped onto the back of them. Sometimes I print them in kind of I can never pronounce this word, stereoscopic 3D, and I provide 3D glasses to view them. And that kind of plays with this idea of 2D, 3D, again, because they started off as these 3D images and then are 3D sculptures, and then they became images on the internet, and then they were taken off that and turned back into these 3D objects, but they're still 2D, and it's a whole thing. So the frames then, the wooden frames, are partly painted in cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. And this is, again, just a reference to the prints I make that kind of go with these objects. So they're kind of talking to each other. Other little things would be, I chose the image of Hercules, because this is an image that's used a lot in etchings and engravings that you'd see of the French Revolution. Hercules was seen as the protector of the people. So you would see these scenes of guillotine beheadings, and in the corner there'd be just like a little Hercules with his club over his shoulder. What else? In some of them I would Photoshop on like separate legs or different arms, and that's just my little nod to Henry Blundell. And then there's the titles. I like to kind of play with titles in my work. Sometimes they're very pretentious, like these ones. But for these ones, I was very specific. So titles like the Farnese Hercules, which is this guy. So the original title of this is Farnese Hercules, 4th century BC, but I always call it Farnese Hercules, 4th century BC, later Irish copy. And then this guy is, or this girl, sorry, is the 21st copy of a lost Greek original. So I'm trying to place them in the present. So I'm kind of playing with their kind of temporal status, as it were. And so these works, they exist alongside other works. So it would exist in a space with bronze sculptures that I've made. So the bronze then is this kind of precious material, but I take casts from these kind of crudely carved styrofoam figures. So they're it's kind of playing with that idea of value, where the styrofoam was just really quickly carved with a craft knife, and then I would spend months taking casts and recasting and casting and casting and casting until I got it right. And that's just another way of kind of putting contradictions back into my work. I also make these huge prints behind me, so they're about 6 meters in length, and they're of columns from the British Museum. So again, that's another nod to the British Museum and to this idea of museums and how they give us information. And I suppose there's not really much more to say about it other than the whole idea behind it is this idea that we live in this kind of post-truth world where objective facts are less important than appeals to emotion and personal belief, kind of fake news stuff. But what happens is these mechanisms of power behind these emotional appeals is obscured. And the whole idea of my work is to try and make people look at an object and see the mechanisms in its making, and maybe rethink how they view these objects when they do see them in a museum. Maybe think about the history of them a little bit more. That might be a bit pretentious of me, but that's what I'm trying to do. So I suppose, in conclusion, through a process of manipulation and reappropriation, I'm trying to undermine that historical and emotional connection that we have to the pristine white marble statue or column or bit of architecture, to try and undermine those 18th century aesthetics that we've all kind of been raised with and that we're still experiencing. And I try to do it in a kind of a playful but pointed way with these little assemblages, and it's kind of a way of exploring the cultural influences and the implications of them in a hegemonic society like the one we live in. And I don't know what else to say, so I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm just going to say thank you so much for listening to me, and I hope you enjoyed it, and thanks so much for going online today and watching all this. It's a tough time, and it's great that we can still share our work with the world, and thanks so much to the Bloomer guys.